March 1979 in Washington, while 3 Mile Island is fixating the country. In Washington, they were having a huge debt ceiling fight. The president was a Democrat, Jimmy Carter. The Senate was controlled by the Democrats. Robert Byrd was the leader in the Senate. The House was controlled by Democrats too. Tip O'Neill was the Speaker of the House. But even though Democrats had control of the White House and both houses of Congress, the Republicans in the House had figured out a way to attach to the debt ceiling an amendment to the United States Constitution. They wanted to attach a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution and make raising the debt ceiling contingent on passing that constitutional amendment. So even though the Republicans were in the minority, they had figured out how to do this. And they were convinced that this was a genius strategy and that it would not only work, it would make the Democrats look terrible in the process. The top Republican in the House at the time was Congressman John Rhodes of Arizona, and he told the New York Times when all this was happening, quote, "I think the Democrats fear a balanced budget like the devil fears holy water." So while 3 Mile Island melted down in Pennsylvania, in Washington, in Congress, they fought and fought and fought and fought and fought right up until the deadline. 3 Mile Island melted down on a Wednesday. The debt ceiling deadline was the following Tuesday. Congress waited until the day before the debt ceiling deadline to finally raise the debt ceiling. And no, the Republicans did not get their balanced budget amendment. They got some sort of meaningless symbolic promises in that direction, but they did ultimately raise the debt ceiling. Turns out, though, they did not raise it fast enough. They got too close. The fact that they waited until the very last minute had really big consequences. And I think part of the reason that this has been sort of lost to history is that nobody was paying attention to it at the time that it happened, because there was something else to pay attention to. There was a legit nuclear meltdown, a non-metaphorical nuclear meltdown on U.S. soil at the same time. So this is what everybody was talking about and paying attention to at the time. But looking back at it now, from this distance, we can see that what Congress was doing while the country was freaking out about that nuclear reactor in Pennsylvania ends up being sort of an important lesson, an important almost dry run in why screwing with the debt ceiling is a really bad idea. There's only a couple of examples of screwing with the debt ceiling in modern history. There's 2011, of course. House Republicans under John Boehner did force us in 2011 to get very, very close to the debt ceiling. There was no actual default in 2011. We didn't end up paying all of our bills, but because we got so close to the debt ceiling that year, we did get our credit rating downgraded as a nation for the first time in history. The Government Accountability Office crunched the numbers later and figured that just that, with no default, just getting close enough to have people smell default, that cost the government about $1.3 billion that it would not have otherwise had to spend. So that's one of the two modern experiences we've had with getting close to the debt ceiling, with this kind of drama. The other one was that one in 1979, and that one was actually worse, even though people don't much think about it, and it's not really a high-profile thing in our modern economic history. But in 1979, in the coincident with 3 Mile Island debt disaster, we did actually partially default on the debt. Congress acted the day before we got to the technical debt ceiling, and they thought they had taken care of it. They thought they had averted the crisis. But in getting so close, in getting within a day of the deadline, they actually got too close, and Treasury bonds that were due to be paid off on April 26th, and on May 3rd, and on May 10th, all of the bonds that came due on those days didn't get paid back on time. Sorry, glitch, we got too close, system overwhelmed, software couldn't handle it. We apparently didn't know how to use those newfangled computing machines at the time, and the Treasury was unable to make all of the payments it was supposed to make on all of the debt that we owned. People who held those specific Treasury bonds did eventually get paid, but they got paid late. They got paid up to a week late. And those delayed payments do mean that we kind of sort of defaulted on that debt for a few days. And because of that, investors sued the United States of America, saying that the U.S. government had not paid what we said we were going to pay. They tried to make the government pay interest for the days when these investors should have had their money, but they didn't because the U.S. was deadbeat and wasn't paying when we said we would. Ultimately, that whole affair ended up hiking the interest rates. Sounds boring, but it ends up being really expensive. The Treasury had to pay higher interest rates on bonds that it wanted to issue thereafter, which means we got to pay people more money for the privilege of them lending us something. Interest rates got hiked by a little more than 0.5%. And it may not sound like much, but that hike in the interest rates didn't go back down when the crisis was averted. We proved ourselves to be untrustworthy, and so the hike in the interest rates stuck with us us as a sort of penalty for having screwed up. And if you add up the cost of all the extra interest payments we had to make because of that screw-up, in the first decade alone, after that little technical just for a second glitchy default in 1979, we spent $12 billion that we would not have otherwise had to spend because we did that. So people saying they were so concerned about debt and deficits made us add $12 billion extra dollars to the debt for no purpose, for nothing in return. You would have been better off setting that cash on fire. At least then it could keep you warm. In this case, it was for nothing.